My father-in-law stood in the doorway of what I had been quietly paying for 3 years, and gave me 24 hours to pack my things and leave. "This is my house," Robert said, his voice carrying the particular flat certainty of a man who has never once questioned his own authority. "And I've decided I'm done having you here. 24 hours. I want you gone." I stood in the kitchen with the new countertops I'd paid to install 8 months earlier, the kitchen where the refrigerator I'd purchased after the old one finally died held food I'd bought with money from an account that, as far as Robert knew, didn't exist, and I felt something inside me go very, very still. Because what Robert didn't know, standing there with his arms crossed, delivering an ultimatum with all the confidence of a man who believed he held every card in this situation, was that I had been paying $4,300 a month for this entire house for the past 3 years. Every mortgage payment. Every property tax bill. Every utility, every repair, every dollar that kept the roof over his head and his wife's head and, yes, over my husband's and my own. He had absolutely no idea. And he was about to find out exactly how badly he had miscalculated this moment. But to understand how I ended up standing in that kitchen, absorbing an eviction notice from a man who had no legal or financial claim to issue one, I need to take you back. Back to the beginning of how I became the invisible financial foundation of a household that treated me, daily, like an inconvenient guest who had overstayed her welcome. My name is Sarah. I married my husband, Tyler, 6 years ago, and we moved into his parents' house, a sprawling, comfortable property in suburban Ohio that Robert and his wife Diane had owned for over 2 decades, almost 4 years ago, during a period that I can only describe as the worst financial crisis of our lives. Tyler had been laid off from his engineering position when his company underwent a massive restructuring, one of those corporate decisions that eliminated entire departments overnight with minimal warning. Around the same time, almost as if the universe had decided to test us specifically, my freelance graphic design business lost its 2 largest clients within the same month, contracts that had represented nearly 70% of my income. We had savings, but not enough to weather both crises simultaneously while maintaining the apartment we'd been renting in the city. The math simply didn't work. When Robert and Diane offered for us to move into their house, they had plenty of space, an entire finished basement that had previously been used only for storage, and Robert, in that initial conversation, had genuinely seemed to extend the offer generously. It felt, at the time, like a lifeline rather than a trap. "Stay as long as you need," Robert had said during that first conversation. "Family helps family. We'll figure out the details once you're both back on your feet." I want to be fair to the version of Robert that existed in that initial conversation, because I think understanding how dramatically things shifted matters for understanding everything that came after. In those early months, there was no demand for rent, no explicit financial arrangement discussed at all. We moved into the basement, grateful and humbled by the necessity of accepting help, while Tyler searched for new engineering positions and I worked to rebuild my client base. Tyler found new work after about 4 months, a good position, though at a smaller company with a noticeably lower salary than his previous role. My business recovered more slowly, but recovered nonetheless, eventually generating consistent income that, combined with Tyler's salary, would have easily supported us in our own apartment again. But we didn't move out. And this is where the story becomes more complicated, more specific to the particular dynamics of Tyler's family, because the reason we stayed wasn't simply convenience or continued financial necessity. It was Robert's escalating, specific requests, which began almost immediately once he realized we were both employed again and therefore, in his calculation, capable of contributing meaningfully to household expenses. "I think it's only fair," Robert said, about 5 months after we'd moved in, during a conversation he initiated at the dinner table with Diane and Tyler present, "that you two start helping with some of the household costs, now that you're both working again. Nothing crazy. Just contributing your fair share." I remember feeling relief at this conversation. Actually, it felt reasonable, appropriate, the kind of arrangement that acknowledged we were adults benefiting from shared space and should contribute proportionally. I expected a conversation about splitting utilities, maybe a modest monthly contribution toward groceries and shared expenses. What Robert actually proposed, over the following weeks, was considerably more extensive. "The mortgage is $2,800 a month," he said, during a follow-up conversation a few weeks later, his tone carrying the specific casualness of someone presenting an unreasonable request as though it were obviously fair. Then there's property tax, that's about $400 a month if you average it out. Utilities run us close to $600 most months, more in summer with the air conditioning. Then there's general maintenance, repairs, that sort of thing, let's say another $300 a month average. So really, if you're going to contribute your fair share for living here, we're looking at somewhere around $4,000 a month total, between the two of you. I remember the specific feeling of that number landing, $4,000, for what was technically still his house, his mortgage, his name on every official document. That seems like a lot for living in the basement, Dad, Tyler said, and I felt a flash of relief that he'd pushed back at all, even mildly. It's not just the basement, Robert said, his voice taking on a slight edge. You're using the kitchen, the living room, the whole house really. You're not just paying for a room, you're paying for access to the entire property. And frankly, I think it's generous that I'm not asking for more, given current rental rates in this area. I want to be honest about why we agreed to this arrangement, because in retrospect, the math never made sense in our favor, and I think part of staying came from a complicated mixture of gratitude, exhaustion from the previous months of financial crisis, and a specific kind of conflict avoidance that I now recognize as a pattern Tyler had clearly learned from years of navigating his father's particular brand of controlling generosity. We agreed to pay $4,000 a month, which over the following months and years, as Robert periodically adjusted the figure upward citing increased costs that were never fully documented or explained, eventually crept up to $4,300. What I discovered, gradually, doing my own research because something about the arrangement had never quite sat right with me, was that Robert's actual mortgage payment was $1,800 a month, not $2,800 as he'd originally claimed. Property taxes were closer to $250 a month, not $400. The utility estimates were roughly accurate, but the maintenance and repair allowance Robert had built into our monthly payment was, as far as I could determine, almost entirely fictional, a buffer he'd created to extract additional money without ever specifically itemizing what repairs that money was actually funding. In other words, we were paying significantly more than the actual cost of housing the entire family, and Robert was pocketing the difference, month after month, year after year, while simultaneously treating me, specifically, given the particular dynamic that emerged over the following years, as guests who should feel perpetually grateful for the privilege of his hospitality. The dynamic that developed over those 3 years was something I've spent considerable time trying to understand and articulate clearly, because it operated on a specific kind of cognitive dissonance that I think many people in similar situations will recognize. I was simultaneously essential to the household's actual financial functioning and treated as fundamentally peripheral to the household's identity and authority structure. Robert made every decision about the house, what got renovated, what color the living room got painted, whether we could have guests over on weekends, what time everyone needed to be quiet in the evenings, with the absolute confidence of someone exercising legitimate ownership authority, despite the fact that the actual financial mechanics keeping that house solvent depended entirely on money I was contributing. And the way he spoke to me, specifically, carried a particular flavor of condescension that I noticed escalating over those 3 years. Comments about how I should be more grateful for having free housing. Remarks, made in front of extended family during holiday gatherings, about how lucky Tyler and I were that his parents had been so generous, language that consistently erased the actual financial reality of our arrangement. "We've really helped these two get back on their feet," I heard him tell his brother during a Thanksgiving gathering 18 months into our arrangement. "Letting them stay here basically rent-free while they got their finances sorted out." I remember standing in the kitchen doorway, holding a serving dish, listening to this casual erasure of the $4,300 I had personally transferred to Robert's account exactly 11 days earlier, and feeling something hard and cold settle in my chest that I didn't yet have a name for. I didn't correct him in that moment. I want to be honest about that, about all the moments across 3 years when I absorbed similarly inaccurate, dismissive characterizations of our financial arrangement without correction, telling myself that maintaining peace within the household mattered more than litigating every instance of Robert's selective memory regarding who actually funded his lifestyle. But that particular Thanksgiving comment planted something that grew, slowly, over the following 18 months, a quiet, methodical decision to start documenting everything. Every transfer. Every receipt for repairs I'd personally funded beyond our monthly payment. Every conversation where Robert misrepresented our financial contribution to extended family or, increasingly, directly to my face. I didn't yet know exactly why I was documenting all of this so carefully. I told myself it was simply prudent financial record-keeping, the kind of organization any reasonable person maintains. But some part of me, I think, already understood that I was building something I might eventually need, protection against a dynamic that felt, with increasing clarity, fundamentally unstable and unfair. That instability finally erupted on a Tuesday evening in March, over what began as an almost absurdly small disagreement about a household chore schedule, and escalated, within the space of perhaps 15 minutes, into Robert standing in the kitchen doorway, informing me that I had 24 hours to leave the house I had been quietly, comprehensively funding for 3 years. "You don't respect this household," Robert said, his voice carrying real anger now, the kind of anger that suggested this confrontation had been building far longer than the immediate trigger of our disagreement about whose turn it was to handle the recycling. "You walk around here like you're entitled to do whatever you want, and frankly, I've had enough. This is my house. I built this life. And I've decided I'm done having you here under my roof, disrespecting the rules I've set." "Robert," I said, my voice carrying a calm that surprised even me, given how rapidly my heart was pounding, "I think you need to think very carefully about what you're saying right now." "I don't need to think about anything," he said. 24 hours. Pack your things. I want you gone." I looked at him for a long moment, this man who had spent 3 years collecting $4,300 a month from me while simultaneously characterizing our presence as an act of his own generosity, who had just attempted to evict me from a house that, in every financial sense that actually mattered, I had been functioning as the primary owner of for years. And I smiled, not warmly, but with the particular clarity of someone who has just realized exactly how completely the other person has miscalculated the situation. "Okay," I said. 24 hours. "That's fine, Robert. But before I go, I think there's something you should probably understand about exactly whose house this actually is. I need to back up and explain something I deliberately left out of how I described our financial arrangement, because the full picture matters enormously for understanding both why I ended up funding the entire house and why Robert remained so completely oblivious to that reality for 3 full years. About 14 months into our arrangement, something happened that fundamentally restructured how money actually flowed through that household, though Robert never fully understood the mechanics of what changed. Tyler's salary at his new, lower-paying engineering position had been covering roughly half of our $4,000 monthly contribution, with my freelance income covering the remainder. This had felt, throughout that first year, like a reasonably balanced arrangement, both of us contributing according to our respective incomes, both of us equally invested in maintaining good standing within Robert's household. Then Tyler's company announced another round of layoffs. This time, it wasn't a department restructuring that eliminated his position outright. Instead, the company offered Tyler a choice: accept a substantial pay cut to remain employed, or risk being among the next round of eliminations if he declined. Tyler, terrified of unemployment after our previous crisis, accepted the pay cut immediately, reducing his income by nearly 40%. This left an enormous gap in our monthly contribution to Robert's household, a gap that, given the rigid $4,000 figure Robert insisted on regardless of our actual financial circumstances, fell entirely on me to fill if we wanted to avoid an uncomfortable conversation about reducing our payment. I want to explain why I chose to fill that gap myself rather than initiating that conversation, because I think the reasoning matters for understanding everything that followed. By that point, 14 months into living in Robert's house, I had watched him respond to even minor pushback regarding our financial arrangement with escalating irritation and thinly veiled threats about reconsidering whether we were welcome to continue staying. A conversation about reducing our monthly contribution, given Tyler's pay cut, felt, based on everything I'd observed, likely to trigger exactly the kind of confrontation and instability that we'd specifically moved into this house to avoid. So instead, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, I began absorbing the gap myself. My freelance business had grown substantially since our initial financial crisis. I had developed a strong client base, raised my rates appropriately as my portfolio and reputation improved, and was generating considerably more income than Robert or even Tyler fully understood, because I had developed the specific habit, somewhere during that first year, of not discussing my actual earnings in detail with either of them. This wasn't initially a calculated decision to deceive anyone. It started simply because Robert's intrusive questions about our finances, questions he asked with increasing frequency as he apparently tried to assess exactly how much additional money he might extract from our situation, made me deeply uncomfortable, and I found myself giving vague, minimizing answers about my income almost instinctively, a self-protective habit that happened to also obscure the actual financial reality from him. By the time Tyler's pay cut hit, I was generating significantly more income than either Robert or Tyler realized, and rather than have the difficult conversation about reducing our contribution given Tyler's reduced salary, I simply began covering the difference myself, transferring the full $4,000 from an account that only I actively monitored, an account whose balance and activity I never specifically discussed with Tyler in detail, partly because our financial conversations had, by that point, become a source of stress I preferred to minimize rather than confront directly. I want to be honest about Tyler's role in all of this, because I think it's more complicated than simple obliviousness or willful ignorance. Tyler knew, in general terms, that I was contributing more than my exact half of our household payment. What he didn't know, what I had specifically avoided detailing for him, was exactly how much more, or the precise mechanics of how I was managing our finances to ensure Robert's monthly figure was met regardless of fluctuations in either of our actual incomes. This avoidance wasn't entirely deliberate deception on my part, though I recognize, looking back, that it functioned that way regardless of my original intentions. It emerged from a pattern that had developed early in our marriage, where Tyler experienced significant anxiety around financial conversations, particularly conversations that highlighted disparities between our incomes or contributions. Rather than navigate that anxiety directly, I had developed the habit of simply managing financial logistics myself, presenting Tyler with simplified summaries rather than detailed breakdowns, a pattern that felt, at the time, like reasonable accommodation of his stress rather than the foundation for a much larger problem. Tyler's relationship with his father added another layer of complexity that I think deserves specific attention, because it explains why he never directly challenged Robert's escalating financial demands or his increasingly dismissive characterization of our contribution to the household. Robert had always been, according to everything Tyler told me about his childhood and according to what I personally observed over 6 years of marriage, a man whose love and approval felt fundamentally conditional, dependent on Tyler's continued deference to Robert's authority and decisions. Tyler had spent his entire life calibrating his behavior to avoid his father's disapproval, a pattern that intensified rather than diminished once we moved into Robert's house, where Robert's daily presence and direct control over our living situation gave him unprecedented leverage over Tyler's choices. "This," I said, setting the folder on the kitchen counter and opening it to the first organized section, "is 3 years of bank transfer records, showing exactly how much money I have personally sent to your account every single month since we moved into this house." I pulled out the first page, a printed spreadsheet I had maintained meticulously, documenting dates, amounts, and corresponding bank confirmation numbers. $4,000 a month for the first 14 months, I continued, my voice remaining level despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Then $4,300 a month for the following 22 months, after you raised the amount citing increased utility costs that, when I actually researched the math, didn't remotely match the actual utility increases for a house this size in this area. Robert's expression shifted from anger to something more guarded, more calculating. "Tyler contributes to that as well. This isn't just you." "Tyler's contribution," I said, pulling out a second document, "has been declining steadily for the past 19 months, since his pay cut. I've been covering the difference myself, every single month, from my business account, which has been generating significantly more income than either you or Tyler have apparently assumed." I watched Diane's expression shift, a particular kind of dawning realization crossing her face that suggested she was processing this information with genuine surprise, rather than the practiced composure Robert was attempting to maintain. "This doesn't change anything," Robert said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "It's still my house. My name is on the mortgage. I make the decisions about who lives here." "That's true," I said. "Your name is on the mortgage. But I think you should also note that I contacted a real estate attorney 3 days ago, after a conversation we had last week that made me start seriously questioning whether this arrangement could continue sustainably." This was, I should note, entirely true. The conversation in question had been Robert's comment about renovating the upstairs bathroom and expecting Tyler and me to contribute an additional $1,500 toward the project, framed, as always, as an opportunity to invest in the family home, despite our complete lack of any ownership stake or decision-making authority regarding that home. What attorney? Why would you need an attorney? Robert's voice carried genuine alarm now, the first crack in his previously unshakable confidence. Because, I said, I wanted to understand my legal position, given that I've been making substantial, regular financial contributions toward a property I have no ownership interest in, contributions that, depending on how a court might eventually characterize them, could potentially be considered something closer to an unwritten lease arrangement, or even, depending on the specific circumstances, contributions that might create certain legal protections regarding notice and proper eviction procedures, rather than simply a casual family living arrangement that you can terminate with 24 hours notice. Robert stared at me, clearly processing implications he hadn't previously considered. You don't have any legal right to stay here. This is my property. You're probably right that I don't have an ownership claim, I said. But what my attorney explained is that, given 3 years of documented, regular payments specifically tied to housing costs, you likely cannot simply demand someone vacate within 24 hours without following proper legal eviction procedures, which typically require considerably more notice, especially when there's a documented pattern of regular payment that could be characterized as an informal tenancy arrangement. I pulled out a third document. This is a letter from my attorney, outlining the relevant Ohio tenant protection statutes that likely apply to our situation, along with documentation of every payment I've made over the past 3 years. I had her draft this specifically because I suspected, given the escalating pattern of your behavior over the past several months, that we might eventually end up in exactly this kind of confrontation. Diane finally spoke, her voice carrying genuine shock. Robert, is this true? Have we really not been paying for anything ourselves this whole time? Of course we've been paying for things, Robert said defensively, though his voice carried noticeably less conviction than it had minutes earlier. We've had this house for 20 years, long before they moved in. That's true, I said. But for the past 3 years, every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every utility payment, has come directly from money I transferred to your account specifically for those purposes. I have the mortgage company's payment confirmations as well, which I obtained by calling them directly 2 days ago and verifying exactly how the payments have been processed. This particular piece of documentation had required a slightly delicate phone call, explaining to a customer service representative that I needed to verify payment history on an account where my husband was listed as an authorized user, though not the primary account holder. The representative had been helpful, confirming, after appropriate verification, that the mortgage had been paid consistently and on time for the entire period in question, with payments processing from the account I specified, the account where my monthly transfers landed before Robert redirected them toward actual housing costs. You called the mortgage company? Robert's voice carried something approaching disbelief now, the particular shock of someone realizing that the person he just attempted to evict had been quietly, methodically preparing for exactly this confrontation for far longer than he'd anticipated. I called several places, I said. The mortgage company, to verify payment history. A real estate attorney, to understand my legal position. And, this morning, actually, after our argument about the recycling, I called a forensic accountant who specializes in family financial disputes, because I wanted a professional assessment of exactly how much money I've contributed to this household over the past 3 years, compared to what would have been a reasonable, fair market contribution for the actual living space and resources we've used. I pulled out the final document in my folder, a preliminary assessment the accountant had emailed me just hours earlier, after I'd shared with her, that morning, the comprehensive records I'd maintained. According to her initial analysis, based on comparable rental rates in this area for similar properties, a fair contribution for the basement living space Tyler and I actually occupy, plus reasonable shared usage of common areas, would be approximately $1,500 a month. I have been paying, on average, $4,150 a month for 3 years. That's a difference of approximately $93,000 beyond what would be considered a fair market contribution for our actual living arrangement. The kitchen went completely silent. Tyler, who had been standing in the hallway throughout most of this confrontation, clearly stunned by information he himself hadn't fully understood until this exact moment, finally spoke. Sarah, is that actually accurate? $93,000? That's the preliminary calculation, I said, looking at my husband with an expression that I hoped conveyed both the seriousness of the financial reality and my own complicated feelings about how long I had managed this situation without fully involving him in understanding its true scope. I can show you all the documentation tonight, once we're somewhere private. Robert's face had gone through several distinct phases during this revelation, moving from anger, to alarm, to something that finally settled into a kind of defensive bargaining. Even if all of this is accurate, this is still my house. I can still decide who lives here. You absolutely can, I said. And if you want me gone within 24 hours, I'll go. But I think you should understand that doing so means immediately losing $4,300 a month in payments that have been keeping your mortgage current and your property taxes paid, and that I will be taking with me documentation that clearly establishes the actual financial reality of this household for the past 3 years, which I suspect might become relevant if you ever attempt to characterize our living situation to extended family, or to anyone else, in the dismissive, inaccurate terms you've used previously. I watched something shift in Robert's expression, a calculation happening behind his eyes that suggested he was finally, genuinely processing the practical consequences of what he'd impulsively demanded just minutes earlier. I think, I continued, that we should all take a step back from this conversation tonight, let everyone calm down, and have a more reasonable discussion tomorrow about what an actually fair arrangement looks like going forward, one that reflects what we're genuinely contributing to this household, and includes some basic respect for the fact that Tyler and I are not simply grateful dependents living here at your mercy. Robert didn't respond immediately. Diane, however, finally found her voice in a way that surprised me, given her general pattern of deferring to her husband throughout our 3 years living there. Robert, she said quietly, I think we need to talk. Just the two of us. Tonight. Robert and Diane disappeared into their bedroom that evening, leaving Tyler and me alone in the basement we'd called home for 3 years, surrounded by the particular silence that follows a confrontation neither of us had fully anticipated happening that night. I need you to explain everything to me, Tyler said, sitting on the edge of our bed, his voice carrying a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something that I recognized, with some discomfort, as genuine hurt. All of it. How long has this actually been happening? Why didn't you tell me? I sat down beside him and walked through everything, finally, without the simplified summaries and protective omissions I'd been offering for over a year. I explained Tyler's pay cut and the gap it created. I explained how I'd quietly absorbed that gap rather than risk the confrontation that discussing it openly might have triggered. I explained the gradual escalation of Robert's demands, the discrepancy between what he claimed expenses cost and what they actually cost, the comments to extended family that erased our actual financial contribution. I should have told you sooner, I said. I think I convinced myself I was protecting you from additional stress, but really, I think I was also avoiding a conversation that felt difficult, about money, about your dad, about all of it. That wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to our marriage, even if my intentions weren't malicious. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, processing this. I think I knew, somewhere, that something didn't add up. The way money seemed to never quite work out the way I expected, the way you always seemed to be handling more than your share without ever making it feel like a big deal. I let myself not ask too many questions because asking would have meant confronting how badly I was failing to actually provide for our family, and confronting my dad about money has literally never gone well, my entire life. I'm not telling you all of this to make you feel guilty, I said. I'm telling you because we need to make decisions together now, real decisions, not me quietly managing things while you avoid conflict with your father. We talked for hours that night, working through not just the immediate situation with Robert, but the larger pattern we'd fallen into, the ways my protective instinct toward managing financial stress had inadvertently enabled both Robert's escalating entitlement and Tyler's avoidance of direct confrontation with his father. By morning, we had a plan, one that didn't depend on whatever Robert and Diane decided after their own private conversation, but represented our own independent decision about what we actually wanted going forward. I don't want to stay here anymore, Tyler said, with a clarity and decisiveness I hadn't heard from him in longer than I could remember. Not after this. Not after realizing how much we've actually been contributing while being treated like we're lucky to be tolerated. I think we need to find our own place. This felt, given everything we'd been through that previous evening, like both an obvious conclusion and a genuinely difficult one, given that our entire financial arrangement over the past 3 years had been built around the assumption of indefinite cohabitation with Robert and Diane. Robert and Diane emerged from their room the following morning, and the conversation that followed was markedly different in tone from the explosive confrontation of the previous evening. "I want to apologize," Robert said, though his voice carried the particular stiffness of someone unaccustomed to genuine apology, someone working through unfamiliar emotional territory. "I didn't fully understand, I think, how much you'd actually been contributing. Diane helped me go back through our own bank records last night, and the numbers, they match what you showed us. I think I'd convinced myself, somehow, that we were still primarily supporting all of this, when really, for quite a while now, you've been the one keeping things financially stable." I appreciated this acknowledgement, though I noticed it stopped short of fully addressing the pattern of dismissive comments to extended family, the controlling restrictions on shared space, the broader entitlement that had characterized his behavior throughout our 3 years there, beyond simply the financial misunderstanding. "I appreciate you acknowledging that," I said. "But Tyler and I have decided, independent of whatever arrangement might be possible going forward, that we're going to find our own place. This isn't really about punishing anyone or proving a point. It's about us actually having autonomy over our own living situation, something we haven't really had for the past 3 years." Robert's expression shifted, something between disappointment and dawning recognition of consequences he hadn't fully anticipated when he'd issued that 24-hour ultimatum. "You don't have to do that. We can figure out a fair arrangement, going forward, that actually reflects what you're contributing." "I think we do have to do that," Tyler said, speaking up with a directness that surprised even me, given how rarely he challenged his father directly. "Not because the financial arrangement couldn't theoretically be fixed, but because the way you've treated Sarah, the way you've treated both of us, over these 3 years, isn't something that gets fixed just by adjusting numbers on a spreadsheet. We need our own space, where we make our own decisions, without needing your approval for basic things like when we can use the living room." The following 6 weeks involved the practical logistics of finding and moving into our own apartment, a process complicated by needing to maintain some financial stability during the transition, but ultimately manageable given that my business income, once fully revealed and accounted for honestly between Tyler and me, was actually more than sufficient to support reasonable independent living, even accounting for Tyler's reduced salary. We moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes from Robert and Diane's house, a space that, while considerably smaller than the house we'd been living in, felt, almost immediately, like genuine freedom in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. The relationship with Robert and Diane evolved slowly over the following year, into something more complicated than either complete estrangement or simple reconciliation. Diane, in particular, made consistent efforts to acknowledge what had happened, eventually telling me, during a lunch we had together about 4 months after we'd moved out, something that helped me understand the situation with more nuance than I'd initially possessed. "Robert grew up with nothing," she said. "His own father struggled financially his entire life, and Robert spent his childhood watching that struggle, watching his father lose jobs, lose the house they were renting, move the family multiple times because they couldn't keep up with bills. I think, somewhere along the way, Robert decided that being the one who provides, who controls the finances, who maintains authority over the household, became fundamentally tied to his sense of being a successful man, a good father, someone who'd escaped his own father's failures. I think when he realized he wasn't actually the one providing, that you were, it threatened something much deeper than just the practical financial reality." This explanation didn't excuse Robert's behavior, the years of dismissive comments, the controlling restrictions, the casual erasure of my actual contribution. But it helped me understand the psychology underlying patterns that had genuinely confused me throughout our 3 years living there, the specific intensity of his need to maintain narrative control over who was actually supporting that household. Robert himself never offered as thorough an explanation or acknowledgement as Diane's insight provided, though his behavior, over the following year, did shift in ways that suggested genuine, if incomplete, reflection. He stopped making comments to extended family characterizing our previous living situation as charity he'd extended. He began, gradually, treating both Tyler and me with a baseline respect that had been notably absent during our years actually living under his roof. I think about that Tuesday evening often, the absurdity of an argument that began with missed recycling bins escalating into a confrontation that revealed 3 years of carefully obscured financial reality, The particular satisfaction of watching someone's confident assumption of complete control collapse the moment actual documentation entered the conversation. But I think, even more often, about what that confrontation taught me about my own patterns, the ways I had quietly absorbed increasing financial and emotional burden rather than risk difficult conversations, the ways that protective instinct, however well-intentioned, had ultimately enabled a dynamic that left both Tyler and me less empowered, less honest with each other than we should have been. The forensic accountant's final, complete assessment, delivered about 3 weeks after our initial confrontation, confirmed what her preliminary analysis had suggested. Over 3 years, I had contributed approximately $91,000 beyond what would have constituted a fair market contribution for our actual living arrangement. Tyler and I ultimately decided not to pursue any legal action regarding that discrepancy, partly because doing so felt like it would prolong and intensify a conflict we genuinely wanted to move past, and partly because the actual outcome we wanted, autonomy and respect within our own household, had already been achieved through our decision to move out entirely. What I gained, beyond the practical resolution of finding our own apartment and establishing genuine financial transparency with Tyler, was a clearer understanding of my own boundaries, my own willingness, going forward, to have difficult conversations directly rather than quietly absorbing imbalance to avoid conflict. Tyler and I are, 18 months later, in a noticeably different place in our marriage, one characterized by financial transparency that didn't exist during those 3 years in his parents' house, by a partnership where difficult conversations happen directly rather than being avoided through one person quietly managing burden alone. Robert gave me 24 hours to leave a house he believed, completely, was his own to control. What he discovered, in the process of attempting that eviction, was that the house had never actually functioned the way he believed it did, that the authority he'd exercised so confidently for 3 years had been built on a foundation of financial reality he'd never bothered to fully understand or acknowledge. He thought he was removing an inconvenient, dependent presence from his household. What he actually did was finally force into the open a truth that had been quietly accumulating for 3 years, that respect, in any household, any relationship, any family, has to be built on honest acknowledgement of who is actually contributing what, rather than narratives convenient to whoever holds nominal authority. If you've ever found yourself quietly absorbing more than your fair share, financially, emotionally, in any capacity, while being treated as though you're the one who should be grateful, I hope this story reminds you that documentation, clarity, and your own willingness to have difficult conversations directly are more powerful than you might currently believe. Leave a comment if this resonated with you. Tell me about a time you discovered the truth was very different from what everyone around you assumed. Subscribe if you want to stay. There are more stories like this one waiting.